Thank you, everyone. I have to be honest with you. I had a bit of a problem starting developing this presentation. In part because I want to talk about conserving things across borders, which means a lot of international goodwill, a lot of international collaboration. And I started working on the presentation a couple of weeks ago when everything that was in the news was, invasion of Venezuela, the invasion of Greenland. All of these things were top of mind. So how do you put something out there that talks about international collaboration in the conservation context that doesn't come across as naive, but definitely doesn't come across as cynical and depressing, right? We want to come out of here with some sense of hope. And I also have to acknowledge, as a Mexican coming here into the city that just recently saw a lot of hatred for people who come from elsewhere, people who look different, and also created a sense of anxiety. And I want to acknowledge that the Friends of the Chicago River have done absolutely everything to make me feel welcome. And we heard from Dexter how important it is that people feel welcome in these spaces, and I certainly feel that. And I definitely didn't have as hard a time crossing the border as this cougar here, trying to cross through what is a vehicle barrier, which is the kind of barrier that was first put out to try and curb the perceived sense of threats on the border. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So in thinking about how to get started, I was looking at what people smarter than me have thought about international collaboration and the role of conservation in this. And I found inspiration, I'm going to need my pointer, as one often does, in the words of a Republican president of the United States, who's the whole Nobel Peace Prize. And this quote is really interesting. It talks about the importance of elevating other countries. I know this is not Donald Trump. This is Theodore Roosevelt, who was addressing the first North American and only North American Conservation Conference back in 1909. This is a picture from that conference, a really interesting snapshot in time. The conference was the brainchild of Gifford Pinchot, who's the gentleman with the big mustache in the back, who, of course, a lot of you know here as the founder of the Forest Service. And Gifford Pinchot had this notion that conservation played an inordinate role in maintaining world order and world peace. And so he brought leaders from across North America. You can see Clifford Sifton from Canada, who was instrumental in growing the national park system in Canada. And you can see Miguel Ángel de Quevedo, the gentleman in the beer sitting down at the extreme. Miguel Ángel de Quevedo is, you can think of it as our Gifford Pinchot, who was, a forester who advanced in Mexico the notion of conservation when this was a totally new concept that nobody was even talking about. And he brought everybody together. Theodore Roosevelt was totally on board with it and decided this is something important. Because his vision was this, worldwide practice of conservation, the fair and continued access to resources are indispensable for permanent peace. This is, of course, today a limited view. We know that nature is not just the natural resources. We've talked a lot here about the relationship to each other, the relationship to landscape. And so it's not just about sharing the natural resources. But, I think it's a good place to start. We start thinking about the intersection between conservation and maintaining good relationships with your international neighbors. And, I think there is a world in the future where we all collaborate a lot better across borders. But Gifford Pinchot did not leave a roadmap for the generations that follow. How exactly you achieve this vision of permanent peace through conservation? And so we each have to find our ways, and there are people who've been tackling it through international bodies like the IUCN and so on. But when I think about it, I think about, what does this continent really look like? And I really like these kinds of mosaic images of the world without plants, because it gives you a sense of how it's all just connected. It's all a single landmass in North America, And the fact that we continue to put borders on it is just this artificial construct that we continue to impose on the landscape. So my personal connection with international collaboration came across thanks to the species, the jaguar. And the northernmost population of jaguars lives in northwest Mexico, and some of these individuals occasionally reach the United States. Maybe for some of you, this is news. Show of hands. How many people here did not know that there are jaguars occasionally in the U.S.? Don't be shy. There's a lot of you. It's like it's okay not to know. That's why we're here, right? To learn. And so yes, these jaguars occasionally reach the United States. And in 1996, 30 years ago, 2 of them were actually seen by mountain lion hunters in Arizona and New Mexico. And both lion hunters reacted in the exact same way. They put down their rifles, pulled up their cameras, and they took pictures of these jaguars. And that started a collaboration between the United States and Mexico to bring back jaguars. And, I was young and naive coming out of Mexico City and working with my American friend from Tennessee, Rick Williams, right there, to establish a sanctuary for these jaguars in one of the most remotest locations you can imagine in the state of Sonora, out there in the Sierra Madre Occidental, trying to protect these jaguars by buying some strategic pieces of land for them to be able to breed unmolested. And this is a great project. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail. The organization that currently manages the reserve is the Northern Jaguar Project. You can look them up. That's their website. But I soon realized, this is the Northern Jaguar Reserve. That little red spot there, that's the habitat of the northernmost population of jaguars. That looks huge. No matter how much land we buy, no matter how effective we are in collaborating with the ranchers around it, there's still a lot that needs to be done at a scale that neither the organization that I was working for at the time, a Mexican small group, or the Northern Jaguar Project, were set out to do. So that's when I came across the vision of Wildlands Network, the course, corridors, compatible lands, and carnivores vision, which is pretty simple. You create corridors between highly protected areas that have buffers of areas that are managed for conservation, but also used by people who are hunting and growing things and using it for forestry and a number of things. And I thought, this is exactly what. And I was just inspired by this vision. I thought this group is so awesome. And I decided, I wanted to work for them. And eventually I did. I've been working with Wildlands Network for 10 years since. And and it's really striking, when you think about the history of this group. It came out of a notion that conservation at the time was not doing enough. It was human-centric. It was all about keeping scenic parks for ultimately privileged people. We all know that a lot of people were not able to travel to these places. And that was the only vision that was out there. And so a bunch of people decided, no, we're biocentric. We want to keep these places for the sake of them. There's an intrinsic value in these places. There's an intrinsic value in the species that live here. And we want those to be protected. And we're missing a lot of that in focusing on what's scenic and what's important to people. And so this is the vision that they developed back in the time. It wasn't much of a diverse group, but I encourage you all to look at our website these days, or you'll see people very different from our founders these days. But I really want to acknowledge that these people, despite not being, incredibly diverse, they definitely understood diversity at that time. And the way they put it out there, this vision of continental connectivity, was through the Wild Earth Journal. It was before there was an internet. This was shipped out to a bunch of people throughout North America, inspiring people to think about nature in a biocentric manner. So there was everything from poetry and art, but also very hard scientific research into the importance of carnivores, for example. When people were very concerned about the wolf introductions that were taking place in Yellowstone and elsewhere, and putting them front and center was really important. And now we all take connectivity for granted. We all talk about connectivity as necessary, but when these ideas were first put out there in this first issue of Wild Earth in 1991, people were discussing what's the merit of corridors. We're pulling money away from highly diverse areas that we should be protecting. And there was a lot of pushback from from scientists back then that the notion of corridors was just, the latest fad. Today we know that's not true. We know we need networks of connected systems of nature, and it's mainstream. But at the time, it was actually radical. And when that map came out, there was a lot of conspiracy theories that the Wildlands Network was colluding with the United Nations to take over people's lands in the West, and that was the vision. And interestingly enough, I had a hard time finding that map, and I found it in one of conspiracy theorists websites. So thank you, right-wing guys. You have kept the history of our organization that even our staff have lost. Because they keep pounding on this idea. So yeah, if you look at the old history of Wildlands Network, don't be surprised if you find us out there in some really weird places of the internet. And the vision is what we call the wildways. This swaths of continental connectivity. The little blue dots represent places where we have some kind of presence or have had in the recent past staff offices, etc. And we're trying to connect these places across the whole of North America. But we are very much like the Friends of the Chicago River, a small group with a big dream. We're probably twice as big as you in our 30 staff. So not a huge organization. In working with the Wildlands Network, I've had the opportunity to develop a more complete large landscape vision of what jaguars need. And this is what it looks like. It's pretty clear, right? Or it might need an explanation. But basically, what we're talking about here is we need breeding habitats that are managed as wilderness. And this is where it really becomes important to understand the culture of where you're working. There's not a word for wilderness in Spanish. There's not a concept of wilderness areas in Mexican legislation. So how do you achieve wilderness level protections in a place that's not really set up to do that culturally? The concept just doesn't exist. And so that is where places like the Northern Jaguar Reserve come in, where you can actually have a group buy the land and manage it for wilderness. That's never going to be vast swaths of public land that simply don't exist in Mexico. Everything is either private or communal, with very little pieces of public lands. And that has got to be connected to other areas where there's voluntary mechanisms of conservation that are more suited to the kind of land tenure structure that we have in Mexico. You need wildlife crossings across roads, and you need to find areas for potential expansion in the United States, but there happens to be a border wall in the middle, and so we have to do something about that border wall. So this vision is what we're basically trying to promote in that landscape. So what we need to do is have an improved understanding of habitat for breeding and connectivity, a network of government and voluntary natural protected areas, the road mitigation piece, and cross-border connectivity. And this is what I'm going to be talking a little bit about. And this is a new generation of models that we're working on to try and understand exactly where jaguars are breeding, where jaguars are connecting. And it's really cool stuff because I like maps, but also because science has advanced so much that we can do it at a resolution that was unthinkable just 5 years ago, where we can actually see, okay, this is actually the best stretch of like half a mile of road for a jaguar to actually cross this road or move across this landscape. This is really, really fine-tuning our understanding of what the habitat provides for these animals. And I don't know if this is going to run, but yes. So we're trying to understand the movement of wildlife, and that means a lot of camera trapping, a lot of monitoring, and that goes in collaboration because there's no way a group of 30 people, most of them in the United States, are going to be able to monitor a vast landscape like this. So we partner with groups across this region to do a lot of our monitoring. And you're seeing a flash from the camera back there because you have to take both sides of the jaguar in order to be able to identify the spots on both sides. Because if you know the spots, you know the individual. Spots are like what you call them, fingerprints. In the sense that you're not going to find two that are exactly the same. That allows us to understand, is this an individual we see? Can we start doing some counting of the number of individuals in this population and so on? This is what I'm talking about here. And in this, we've talked a lot about partnerships throughout the day. Again, essential to partner with people. It's Northern Jaguar Project that keeps the largest database of individuals in this region. from the US, from Mexico, and they can more readily tell us this is an individual that showed up 5-10 years ago somewhere else. And this was a very interesting case where a local group, Profauna, helped us find a picture of a jaguar that was already famous because it's shown around in the Santa Rita Mountains near Tucson. And everybody in Tucson loved El Jefe, and then El Jefe just totally disappeared. And none of the cameras in Arizona were getting pictures of him for a number of years until it showed up back in Sonora, thanks to this collective international effort. And we work with local communities to try and advance private protections. Like I said, not a lot of public land in Mexico. What you see in green are the federally designated protected areas. Those are not public. Those are a layer of regulation over a mosaic of private and communal land that says basically you won't develop these lands, you won't mine on these lands. Thanks to another policy win of Wildlands Network, a very recent one just a few years ago. But other than that, people can ranch, can farm, can do whatever it is they were doing. So definitely not wilderness, but protected from development. And the communities are getting more and more involved in jaguar conservation, and the role is essential, not only because of this land tenure system that we have, but also because these are arid landscapes, and if you can show this short video as well. And so when a rancher puts up water infrastructure for cattle, it is also used by wildlife here. And because the landscape is so dry, wildlife just naturally wherever water is. And so a lot of our work and finding, for example, this female using this space allowed us to find a new breeding area in the state of Sonora. This is only the second area where we have confirmed breeding of jaguars in the state, and it would not have been possible had we not collaborated with the local ranchers there. And there's the video again. Yes. Another piece of this is, of course, the ecology piece. This is a niche that we found, and we're working very heavily into road ecology, both in the US and Mexico. But here particularly, I'm going to focus on the Mexico piece of it. And part of it was conducting some research to try and understand the infrastructure that's already there for water. A lot of the drainages and bridges under the highways that we seldom see as we're driving real fast through them. Is it being used by wildlife? And we know it is being used by wildlife, and we definitely, by partnering with this other group, Proyecto Jaguar, we've been able to document jaguars using these drainages under the highways to move from one place to another. And there. And we also facilitate exchanges. What you see here in the picture is a bunch of us. You might see there's something up there that's basically the underside of a massive wildlife underpass just north of Tucson. And there's the people in the picture are U.S. and Mexico road officials, wildlife officials. We organized a meeting for the road experts from Mexico to get a sense of the kind of structures we were talking about. We often, you reach out to an agency and tell them we need wildlife crossings. What do you get? The big no, as John was reminding us. This is never going to happen. But then you facilitate the exercise. You bring them there. You show them it's doable. They get excited. This is a neat infrastructure, and this is all that's been happening in the U.S. Maybe you can do some of that in Mexico. And you sort of. I often think of the work of a conservationist as akin to that of the writers of science fiction. You have to imagine a different future. And now that you've imagined that different future, you have to convince a lot of people that it is possible, that it is real, that it is tangible. And that is our work. So I often tell people, young people that I work with, that I mentor in some way, shape, or form, you have to read fiction. Because if you're not exercising your imagination, there's no way you're going to be able to convince somebody that a better future is possible. Because you can't even imagine that better future. A lot of our work revolves around inspiring the right people to do the right thing. And eventually, we hope to get some of these large underpasses for jaguars in some of the key highways in Sonora. And now moving on to the difficult part of it, the border wall. As you can see, this picture gives you a sense of the scale of the devastation. This is a scar that will probably not heal on the landscape in a geologic sense of time. It is absolutely massive. Our group has partnered with Sky Island Alliance in monitoring the impacts of the border wall. And we've developed the most comprehensive map of where the border wall exactly is. What kind of border wall do you find? Because there's not just one kind of border wall. As you remember from the picture at the beginning, there's a vehicle barrier that you can see down there. And then at some point it ends and you have these bollards that are the most difficult for animals to get across. There are stretches in the wildest, most remote and rugged areas that are still open, but we anticipate that by the end of this federal administration, those will also be blocked. And so what we're seeing is a landscape that is changing rapidly to the detriment of all the animals that move from one place to another, and definitely a setback to jaguar recovery in the United States. So we published the first comprehensive paper on these impacts because we think you definitely have to conduct the research, put it out there, document the impact. Maybe there's a future where people will be more inspired to conduct, to borrow another expression from John a little while ago, border wall modifications. The kind that need a little TNT or something like that. That's kind of what we need here. Some border wall modifications, but we are doing less aggressive border wall modifications. What you're seeing there is somebody measuring one of the little gaps that we've convinced the Department of Homeland Security to actually place along the border wall to facilitate wildlife movement. And these are about the size of a page. They're about that size, and you would not believe the kind of animals that actually make it across, because at this point, I think it will start in like there. It is clear that large carnivores are having trouble crossing the border wall. And blackbirds are particularly important for Mexico because the population of blackbirds in Mexico is smaller. It's designated as endangered by Mexico, even if it's hunted freely in Arizona and not considered endangered in the U.S. But it depends on those animals coming from the U.S., where they're a lot more abundant, to maintain its genetic health. And we don't know what long-term impacts isolating the Mexican population might have on them. And this was achieved thanks to the Sierra Club actually leading on a lawsuit to keep these places open. And so the settlement was, let's put these places for animals to eventually cross the border. And, if you look real close at that video, there's actually one of those openings right there, right behind those front paws of that bear. But that bear didn't recognize that, and probably wouldn't have been able to cross right there. But here's a little something that gives us hope.
Oh my God.
So female cougar can make it across. We think male cougar can't so far. Just by probably an inch or so wider than these crossings were, they would be able to make it across. We still have to see a jaguar using one of these. They're definitely less abundant, and we don't expect to see one soon, but one can hope. But these are the kinds of things that you can do even in the most adverse political landscapes. And if you want to learn more about our border work, I encourage you to look at an upcoming National Geographic issue that it's a February issue, so it'll be out in Walgreens and everywhere else where it is you shop. But if you want to get a sneak peek at the great photo article they put together, you can use that QR code or that tiny URL up there in the corner. And still a lot of work to do on the border wall, but it's what leads the way in our international conservation efforts. We're doing the same work for the Californians, in Baja California and California, with, again, a number of partners that are concerned about this and sending comments to DHS as it builds sections of wall in some of the places that remain still open. And we're also collaborating with the Cincinnati Zoo and a species that used to exist also on both landscapes, the thick-billed parrot, talking about fantastic birds. So the thick-billed parrot is now extirpated in the United States. There's no longer a population of pickled parrots here, but there is one remaining population in Mexico. And the intent is to continue protecting this population and eventually facilitate some reintroductions or having the animals move north naturally as their numbers increase. And, with all this border experience, we started looking at Canada. And, I was asked to lead that effort because I started out the Mexico program. I'm one of the few staffers who actually knows French. And so that was not like, now I'm working on that other border. And this is a real interesting, very, very different landscape with very, very different challenges. But this is a three borders area where we're collaborating with a group of organizations from Quebec, New Brunswick, and Maine that are also concerned about connectivity in a landscape that is in constant change. And I'd like to bring up the example of Canada lynx because it's one of these species that have unique challenges across jurisdictions. They're an endangered species in the U.S., a very important species for the state of Maine. New Brunswick does not allow hunting or trapping of lynx, but it does happen occasionally and it has to be reported to authorities. And Quebec has absolutely no protections for them. They can be freely hunted, trapped, and they are constantly. And so it's, how do you protect a species like this in a landscape where they're going to be moving across all these three jurisdictions and they're going to enjoy different levels of protection depending on where they are in relation to some imaginary line that we decided to put there. So we're trying to understand the corridors. This was a first attempt at modeling connectivity in the region. It was most of all a learning experience. A lot of the challenges that we face, I don't think these models are exactly what we need, but they tell us what we need to do to get the models that we need. And, we facilitate meetings at these groups. This site visit we did in the Madawaska-Maliseet First Nation lands, where the members of the First Nation shared with us their concerns about climate change and the sort of mitigation efforts that they've been doing and how it relates to connectivity. So it's one of these great opportunities to bring people together and figure out ways to come up with creative ideas. And one of the things that we're thinking is our new generation of models need to really understand forest structure. And one of the ways we think about doing that is creating a model that's a merge of land cover and LiDAR data from all these three jurisdictions to try and see, can we know the structure of the forest in the level of detail that we know? Because species like the lynx will move about old forest to connect from one place to another, meets old forest to build a den, but it will actually hunt in very young forest about 7 years old, which is preferred by snowshoe hare, which is their favorite food. And so they need a mosaic of structures. And do we know where those mosaics are available for them? At this point in time, we don't necessarily do. But if we put together all the right data, we may be able to find that out. And we put out a grant proposal for that. I hope to have some better news in maybe a year or two when we're ready with that project. We're also supporting local groups that want to protect some of these lands. And so this grant also considers money for CPAWS Brunswick to protect some water important lands in New Brunswick, and for Horizon Nature to protect some very important connectivity areas on the side of Quebec. And the last component of this joint project is getting money to set up camera traps and training community members on their use, because before springing into saying lynx is the species we want to work here, or maybe American marten, what we want to do is what species are important for the communities, and then figure out which ones might be good flagship species to discuss connectivity, and then developing our projects alongside community members so that they make sense for everybody and not just for these constellation of conservation groups at this point in time. And so at the last conference where we met Margaret, somebody brought up the question, what is a recommendation for working across international borders? And at the time, the question sort of caught me off guard, and I brought an idea up. I've had some time to reflect on this since, and these are some insights that I thought I'd share with you. I think also apply in other landscapes. So the first one is study the geography and learn the history. And thanks again Annette for telling me a lot about the geography and the history of the Chicago River, because it all makes sense once you know that basic landscape. And how does the geography and the history of a particular landscape affect the conditions right now? If you don't know that, then you're only focusing on something very superficial. We want to protect the jaguar, and the jaguar is a cool species. And I see that happening a lot with my U.S. partners. They want jaguars in Tucson right now. And so if they have to pull them out from zoos and release them, that's great. We have a population of jaguars in the U.S. And it's not about that, in my opinion, as much as I respect their efforts. In my opinion, it's about protecting systems of life and relating with these systems of life in a way that they're resilient generation after generation. So we don't repeat some of the errors that we made with Mexican wolves, where we have hyper-managed populations that are in opposition to what the community wants. And so we definitely have to start with the geography and with the history. And you're going to find the land history of Mexico, Canada, and the US are so different that if you don't know anything about it, it's really hard to work effectively across borders. The relationship to the land is going to be affected. Some people are very attached to the land, and for others, it's just a place to put a flag on, exploit it, move on. Then there's the land tenure is going to be affected by that, as I've explained a few times. The resource management. What is it you want to extract from here? How are you going to do it? The conservation approaches. Things like trapping, for example, in Mexico are perceived as total taboo. You would never trap an animal in terms of a livelihood. You might go out and hunt it, you might go out and fish. Trapping is unthinkable, whereas it's an inherent part of the French-Canadian culture. You absolutely trap animals. It's not the wrong thing to do. And then native people's realities. If you're not aware of who was displaced from this landscape, are they trying to recover? Do they have a claim? Do they have a relationship with this landscape? And how are you going to navigate that as you're proposing how to manage this landscape? Then definitely it doesn't help. And this is a map I made of this area of the three borders and around when I was trying to get a sense of this. And so I thought, I got to understand the topography. So I did a little elevation map and decided I'm going to put the colors of the fall transition from green to red to give me a sense of the altitude. And so this is how I approach it. I try to learn as much as I can on my own before approaching people and learning from them, so that I'm not totally naive. But also you need to practice cultural humility, which means I don't have a perceived perspective. I haven't put you on a box of you are Mexican or you're a Southwestern United States person or you are French Canadian. I want to learn from you. I don't know your culture. The first thing I assume is I don't know enough about your culture, so tell me about it. And also self-reflect. What kind of prejudices do you have? When I started working in an international landscape, honestly, my prejudice towards Americans was, these are loud people that think they own the world. They show up wherever they want to show up and do whatever they want to do. And that's probably right to describe some American people, but I soon learned that's not every American person. And that's definitely not the culture of the Southwest, where they collaborated with the border with Mexico for many, many years. And so you have to be able to be honest about what am I thinking about these people that's absolutely wrong? What are my own prejudices? And so identify how your own cultural biases or others might be affecting the group dynamics. Are we not understanding each other because you think they're thinking that? And you might be totally wrong. You have to be constantly curious and inquire and engage people with openness. You want to know about their food, you want to know about the landscape, their history, their families, how they get there, everything. And at some point you have to say, you know more about this, so you should be the one taking lead here. When you're facilitating these kinds of international efforts, there's no way you're going to know everything about a landscape or a culture. So at some point, just step back and let others do the work. You have to leverage complementary values. I've learned, that accountability is a lot more important to Americans than it is to Mexicans. And that's been, a hard pill to swallow when your Mexican partners are not turning up the reports when they should on time and inform. And so you have to strangle them a little for them to provide the reports, because you have to tell them, our U.S. donors really value accountability. And conversely, Americans try to solve every problem ahead of time and plan everything. It's like Mexico's just have to make it. And people are comfortable winging it. You just have to go there, and as magnificent as your plan can be, the reality on the ground is going to be totally unpredictable, and you have to feel comfortable with that. And some people are not comfortable, and so you have to leverage whatever values you're finding in the best moment. Try to speak the language. And I'm not being sure. It is helpful when you speak multiple languages. But what I'm talking about here is we appreciate it when somebody's making an effort to say, hola, buenos dias, gracias. Just the basic things, the basic things that connect us as human beings. If you're trying to do that, it's great. You came across as somebody who's, open. You might not know the language, but you're open to learning a few more words. Or maybe you feel comfortable with a conversation in Spanish going on, and you're picking up on the main ideas, even though you're missing a lot of it. But that allows for your Mexican partners to talk to each other in a spirit of confidence. When you're there and you're sharing a little bit of that, and it loosens things up. And of course, if you can take it to the next level, if you're going to be committed to this, just take the time to learn another language. It's a great opportunity. And conduct site visits. Our relationship to places is essential. And when you go to a place with somebody that has a totally different culture from you, but you both share a love of this particular place, whether it's a shared watershed or a shared forest or anything, you get an opportunity to really connect with people, even if you don't speak the same language. I've seen groups of people where you end up seeing, two people became friends and they don't even speak each other's language, but they just kind of connected on that site visit in a way they would never have connected in a meeting. So those are hopefully helpful ideas for cross-cultural connectivity. And I know it's been mentioned you don't have an international border to concern yourselves about right here, but there might be an urban-rural divide. There might be a scientist-manager divide. There might be a politician-layperson divide. So those cultural divides exist everywhere. And I think many of these things that we've learned over time have been helpful and are applicable in different places. And I want to finish with this landscape because this is where I draw inspiration from. The Native Land Digital Project is a Canadian project to map where native land has been at some point in time. And they do this linguistically. So these are the different linguistic groups across North America. And as you can see, the borders are fuzzy. They overlap. They're not hard borders like we recognize them now. It's a bit artificial. Not all of these indigenous communities existed exactly as you see them at the same point in time. There's an overlap also in time. It's not just a geographic overlap. And I think we have to rethink borders in this way. We kind of take for granted that borders exist, but the reality is, for the longest time in human history, they did not exist. They were not needed. People were able to move freely from one place to another. The nation state is a construct that has a few hundred years of existence. The hard borders where you're not allowed to cross are a concept that came up around the time of the First World War, when passports and visas were initially required for people to move across countries in Europe. Before that, people were just moving across the landscape very freely. That is natural. Movement of wildlife, of people, is life. It is part of our genes to move from one place to another. We recognize that a species wants to move in the winter to find better conditions to survive. Yet we can't recognize that people want to move to another place to find better conditions to survive. That's bonkers. That goes against science, absolutely. So how do we rethink borders in a way that they're maybe permeable, maybe they overlap, maybe they change over time? I know it seems crazy, but again, imagining futures that do not exist right now is how we get to those futures. And the other piece of this is a quote from my favorite author, which is Ursula Le Guin, a California, Oregon author, who, inspired by the Black Elk, thought that every land is important to somebody. What you see in this map is this land was important to somebody, and you have to acknowledge that you're treading on somebody's holy land, wherever it is you're treading. So learn about that particular piece of land. And it often will be at that scale. Nobody thinks of, North America is my holy land. And nobody thinks of the United States is my holy land. They think about the little corner of Wisconsin or the little corner of Illinois. That's really important to them. That is the scale we like to think of. That's a scale that a human brain and heart can really embrace. And so when you're walking there, talk to to the people that care about that place at that scale, that consider it its holy land, or their holy land. And so I'm going to leave it there with this little picture of a bunny having a hard time crossing the border. And the bunny can't cross now. There are these little small crossings. That's comforting for some of you. But my email address is right there. If you want to check it out, and thank you.
Time for a few questions.
I was curious if you could, so I was thinking before you said it about the climate change aspect of how you address connectivity. And I guess I was just wondering if you can touch on that a little bit further and how future projections of climate change are influencing some of these connectivity plans. I'm thinking especially in areas like this Southwest where drought, I imagine, would be a concern going forward.
Yeah, definitely. A part of it is modeling, and we're doing modeling at a scale, climate modeling. We're collaborating with researchers from the state of Washington who are developing a very complex model of climate connectivity across the Pacific. And it's really interesting because you start looking at places that maybe you would have totally overlooked, but they're going to become relevant to some species in the future, or they might retain, for whatever reason, characteristics that make them more resilient as climate changes. So definitely the science is a strong component of that. But we also, you can't really predict how everything is going to turn out. But what we do know is that vast networks of diverse and connected landscapes provide resiliency and adaptation possibilities to wildlife and people. The opposite, little isolated patches of green surrounded by development, does not provide that kind of resiliency, that kind of opportunities for adaptation. So even though it was this model of cores and corridors was not developed with climate change specifically in mind, it turns out it's probably the best nature-based solution you can implement in the long term, just because of its scale. You're talking about a network of this scale across all of North America. Wow, I was Fred was here on the show.
Do you notice anything that acts as a particular barrier to migratory birds? Like the fence isn't an issue to them, but what seems to be challenging?
The fence is an issue to some birds. Interestingly enough, there are pygmy owls that will perch on a branch here, and then they'll fly to another tree within a certain distance. Anything farther than that, they will not go for it. It's too far, it's too uncomfortable for them. But their flight pattern is a U. They go down, they drop, and then they fly back up. And so as the border wall was built, there's very interesting research. I would say the first paper to come out on the impact on the border wall, it was on that single species, how this pygmy bird was not able to make it across the border wall because it never flies above a certain height. And so again, test your assumptions about what's happening. When we started conducting road ecology surveys, we found a lot of birds. So that would be the main barrier, I would think. Again, people assume birds are just flying above the cars, but that's just not the case. A lot of them are dropping from trees next to the road, and before they can go up, they just get driven over. And so that is definitely a barrier. And then you have birds that can't fly long distances in a single go. They need stopovers along the way. And if you have habitat fragmentation that does not provide for enough stopovers, some of the smaller species might actually be impacted. So even though we're not super focused on birds, we definitely have seen the impact of habitat fragmentation and roads on many of these species. There's another question here.
One of the things that I don't know anything about jaguars, as you highlighted. One of the things I followed as we reintroduced large carnivores in the United States is their interaction with like ranchers and things like that. Now, is that something that's an issue with jaguar restoration, and how do you deal with it?
Yes, it's a very interesting one because When we started protecting jaguars in Sonora, there were a bunch of ranchers that were concerned. What does jaguar conservation mean? Are we going to bring a bunch of jaguars? We don't need those. Those are predators and they're eating our cows and whatnot. And so we said, first of all, we're not bringing any more jaguars. These are just protecting the jaguars that are already in the landscape, including your ranches. So let's try and figure out what the problem is. And we set up a program that's called Viviendo con Felinos. That I was in charge of launching that program back in 2007. It goes on without me, so it's going to be turning 20 next year. And so we put up camera traps in ranches, and they take pictures of jaguars and other felines. And ranchers who participate in the program have to allow for biologists to go into these ranches and check everything out. They have to agree to not hunt or trap or poison wildlife, and so the biologists also check for compliance. And then if a picture is obtained, they get a monetary incentive. And so this was developed actually thanks to another international collaboration, because when we were thinking about the conflict of ranchers and carnivores, in our board was a man called Craig Miller, who worked for Defenders of Wildlife, running the Mexican wolf program in the U.S. that was paying ranchers for every dead cow. And they thought, and he told us, don't go that route. We've tried it, and over the years, it doesn't build goodwill for wolves, because there's always an incident, there's always a conflict, there's always going to be a cow that doesn't really look like it was killed by a wolf, but the rancher is convinced it was a wolf, and so they don't get paid. It's just a huge, big drama. So instead of paying for the dead cow, we're paying for the live cat, and that has brought up a lot of goodwill with the ranchers in that community. Some of them are embracing the jaguar as, the emblematic species of the region. And it came along with, like, any incident you have of predation, let us know. We will track it down. We will help you address it. As it turned out, they weren't having it. The perception of threat was all the way up here, whereas the reality of predation was way, way lower than that. And so by talking with the community and offering an incentive to protect these animals, we were able to demonstrate that and tone down the conversation several notches. So that definitely needs to happen. And you have to acknowledge that the concern and the anxiety is there, because ranchers are facing a whole suite of issues that they can do nothing about. Market prices, climate change, disease, etc. But then comes a jaguar, and that's something I can do something about. So the first thing they think is, let's go and hunt it, trap it, kill it, whatever, because it's the one thing that they feel empowered to address in a constellation of things that they feel totally powerless. And if you don't acknowledge that social context of it, and you just show up with your data and say, no, it's not happening, here's the data to show that it's not happening, you're not going to get very far with that community. So yeah, definitely something to address.
The underpass that allowed the movement of the jaguar or whatever underneath highway roads, were those initially designed for the movement of terrestrial animals, or were they actually designed for streams that could have been dry and then terrestrial animals took advantage of them?
The one you saw in that video of the jaguar actually crossing, that's a stream underpass, definitely. That's going to be the case for most everything in Mexico. What we're finding out is if you build them a little larger, maybe with a little more vegetation around, with the right kind of structure and some fencing around them, they can serve that dual purpose, and they can be a lot more effective for certain species of animals. And so part of the research was trying to understand what animals are using, which ones aren't, and we found some interesting stuff. Black bears having perfectly usable underpasses for water, they were not using it at all, and they were getting hit on the highway. Whereas coatis, which are a tropical relative of raccoons, we never saw them in the roadkill surveys, and we thought, why aren't we seeing any roadkill coatis? Are they not here? And it was only until we started putting cameras in the underpasses that we realized, well, these guys are smart. Not one of them is crossing over the highway. All of them are crossing under the highway. And so it's going to vary by species, the use of these structures. And you have to really accommodate the design of the structure and definitely the fencing around it that channels the animal towards them to your target species.
A quick add-on is that myself and somebody else at the University of Illinois wrote a report last year through the state about how to design stream crossings under roads. Being aquatic, we focused on that, but then tagged on. with a little bit of additional modifications, you can facilitate terrestrial animal movement as well. So the state is thinking about this. In Illinois, I'm not going to say that we're doing a fantastic job at it. We're doing a better job.
No,
And
definitely
that's on the radar.
all across North America, the tide is changing, you know, and there's a pilot project that was launched by the Biden administration to provide matching funds for states that want to build these structures, mostly large infrastructure for elk and grizzly and things like that that really need a lot of money, but it's popular across the whole landscape. So smaller structures have been built for even Atlantic salmon and other species, you know. And that pilot project was so popular that we now have 2 or maybe 3 bills in Congress, all of them bipartisan, that are making their way across the process to not only renew the project, but actually increase the funding that the feds are putting towards states that are willing to invest in these infrastructures, because it was immensely popular in red, blue, and purple states. So definitely something that is changing all over. And in Mexico, a lot of our work has been that change of culture, not so much specific bricks and mortar projects, but the whole changing the attitudes of the decision makers.
Thank you. Can we get another round of applause for